This is The Boy's Life of Mark Twain, Chapter 21. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Boy's Life of Mark Twain by Albert Bigelow Paine, Chapter 21, The Territorial Enterprise. In 1852, Virginia City, Nevada, was the most flourishing of mining towns. A half-crazy miner named Comstock had discovered there a vein of such richness that the Comstock lode was presently glutting the mineral markets of the world. Comstock himself got very little out of it, but those who followed him made millions. Miners, speculators, adventurers swarmed in. Every one seemed to have money. The streets seethed with an eager, affluent, boisterous throng, whose chief business seemed to be to spend the wealth that the earth was yielding in such a mighty stream. Business of every kind boomed. Less than 2 years earlier, J.T. Goodman, a miner who was also a printer and a man of literary taste, had joined with another printer, Dennis McCarthy, and the two had managed to buy a struggling Virginia City paper, the Territorial Enterprise. But then came the high tide of fortune. A year later the Enterprise, from a starving sheet in a leaky shanty, had become a large, handsome paper in a new building, and of such brilliant editorial management that it was the most widely considered journal on the Pacific coast. Goodman was a fine, forceful writer, and he surrounded himself with able men. He was a young man, full of health and vigor, overflowing with the fresh spirit and humor of the West. Comstockers would always laugh at a joke, and Goodman was always willing to give it to them. The Enterprise was a newspaper, but it was willing to furnish entertainment even at the cost of news. William Wright, editorially next to Goodman, was a humorist of ability. His articles, signed Dan de Quille, were widely copied. R. M. Daggett, afterward United States Minister to Hawaii, was also an Enterprise man, and there were others of their sort. Samuel Clemens fitted precisely into this group. He brought with him a new turn of thought and expression. He saw things with open eyes, and wrote of them in a fresh, wild way that Comstockers loved. He was allowed full freedom. Goodman suppressed nothing. His men could write as they chose. They were all young together. If they pleased themselves, they were pretty sure to please their readers. Often they wrote of one another, squibs and burlesques, which gratified the Comstock far more than mere news. It was just the school to produce Mark Twain. The new arrival found acquaintance easy. The whole Enterprise force was like one family. Proprietors, editor, and printers were social equals. Samuel Clemens immediately became Sam to his associates, just as de Quille was Dan and Goodman Joe. Clemens was supposed to report city items, and did, in fact, do such work, which he found easy, for his pilot memory made notes unnecessary. He could gather items all day, and at night put down the day's budget well enough, at least to delight his readers. When he was tired of facts, he would write amusing paragraphs, as often as not something about Dan or a reporter on a rival paper. Dan and the others would reply, and the Comstock would laugh. Those were good old days. Sometimes he wrote hoaxes. Once he told with great circumstance and detail of a petrified prehistoric man that had been found embedded in a rock in the desert, and how the coroner from Humboldt had traveled more than 100 miles to hold an inquest over a man dead for centuries, and had refused to allow miners to blast the discovery from its position. The sketch was really intended as a joke on the Humboldt coroner, but it was so convincingly written that most of the coast papers took it seriously and reprinted it as the story of a genuine discovery. In time they awoke, and began to inquire as to who was the smart writer on the Enterprise. Mark Twain did a number of such things, some of which are famous on the coast to this day. Clemens himself did not escape. Lamps were used in the Enterprise office, but he hated the care of a lamp, and worked evenings by the light of a candle. It was considered a great joke in the office to hide Sam's candle and hear him fume and rage, walking in a circle meantime, a habit acquired in the pilot-house, and scathingly denouncing the culprits. Eventually the office-boy, supposedly innocent, would bring another candle, and quiet would follow. Once the office force, including Quill, McCarthy, and a printer named Stephen Gillis, of whom Clemens was very fond, bought a large imitation meerschaum pipe, had a German silver plate set on it, properly engraved, and presented it to Samuel Clemens as genuine, in testimony of their great esteem. His reply to the presentation speech was so fine and full of feeling that the jokers felt ashamed of their trick. A few days later, when he discovered the deception, he was ready to destroy the lot of them. Then, in atonement, they gave him a real meerschaum. Such things kept the Comstock entertained. There was a side to Samuel Clemens that, in those days, few of his associates saw. This was the poetic, the reflective side. Joseph Goodman, like McFarlane in Cincinnati several years earlier, recognized this phase of his character and developed it. Often these two, dining or walking together, discussed the books and history they had read, quoted from poems that gave them pleasure. Clemens sometimes recited with great power the Burial of Moses, whose noble phrasing and majestic imagery seemed to move him deeply. With eyes half closed and chin lifted, a lighted cigar between his fingers, he would lose himself in the music of the stately lines. By Nebo's lonely mountain, on this side Jordan's wave, in a vale in the land of Moab there lies a lonely grave, and no man knows that sepulchre, and no man saw it e'er, for the angels of God upturned the sod, and laid the dead man there. That his own writing would be influenced by the simple grandeur of this poem we can hardly doubt. Indeed, it may have been to him a sort of literary touchstone, that in time would lead him to produce, as has been said, some of the purest English written by any modern author. End of chapter 21. This is Chapter 22 of The Boy's Life of Mark Twain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Boy's Life of Mark Twain by Albert Bigelow Paine. Chapter 22. Mark Twain. It was once when Goodman and Clemens were dining together that the latter asked to be allowed to report the proceedings of the coming legislature at Carson City. He knew nothing of such work, and Goodman hesitated. Then, remembering that Clemens would at least make his reports readable, whether they were parliamentary or not, he consented. So, at the beginning of the year 1863, Samuel Clemens undertook a new and interesting course in the study of human nature, the political human nature of the frontier. There could have been no better school for him. His wit, his satire, his phrasing had full swing. His letters, almost from the beginning, were copied as choice reading up and down the coast. He made curious blunders at first as to the proceedings, but his open confession of ignorance in the early letters made these blunders their chief charm. A young man named Gillespie, clerk of the house, coached him, and in return was christened Young Jefferson's Manual, a title which he bore for many years. A reporter named Rice, on a rival Virginia City paper, the Union, also earned for himself a title through those early letters. Rice concluded to poke fun at the Enterprise reports, pointing out their mistakes. But this was not wise. Clemens, in his next contribution, admitted that Rice's reports might be parliamentary enough, but declared his glittering technicalities were only to cover misstatements of fact. He vowed they were wholly untrustworthy, dubbed the author of them the Unreliable, and never thereafter referred to him by any other term. Carson and the Comstock papers delighted in this foolery, and Rice became the Unreliable for life. There was no real feeling between Rice and Clemens. They were always the best of friends. But now we arrive at the story of still another name, one of vastly greater importance than either of those mentioned, for it is the name chosen by Samuel Clemens for himself. In those days it was the fashion for a writer to have a pen name, especially for his journalistic and humorous work. Clemens felt that his Enterprise letters, copied up and down the coast, needed a mark of identity. He gave the matter a good deal of thought. He wanted something brief and strong, something that would stick in the mind. It was just at this time that news came of the death of Captain Isaiah Sellers, the old pilot who had signed himself Mark Twain. Mark Twain. That was the name he wanted. It was not trivial. It had all the desired qualities. Captain Sellers would never need it again. It would do no harm to keep it alive, to give it a new meaning in a new land. Clemens took a trip from Carson up to Virginia City. "Joe," he said to Goodman, "I want to sign my articles. I want to be identified to a wider audience." "All right, Sam. What name do you want to use? Josh?" "No, I want to sign them Mark Twain. It is an old river term, a leadsman's call, signifying 2 fathoms, 12 feet. It has a richness about it. It was always a pleasant sound for a pilot to hear on a dark night. It meant safe waters." He did not mention that Captain Sellers had used and dropped the name. He was not proud of his part in that episode, and it was too recent for confession. Goodman considered a moment. "Very well, Sam," he said. "That sounds like a good name." A good name indeed. Probably, if he had considered every combination of words in the language, he could not have found a better one. Today we recognize it as the greatest nom de plume ever chosen, and somehow we cannot believe that the writer of Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn and Roughing It could have selected any other had he tried. The name Mark Twain was first signed to a Carson letter, February 2nd, 1863, and after that to all of Samuel Clemens' work. The letters that had amused so many readers had taken on a new interest, the interest that goes with a name. It became immediately more than a pen name. Clemens found he had attached a name to himself as well as to his letters. Everybody began to address him as Mark. Within a few weeks he was no longer Sam or Clemens, but Mark Twain. The coast papers liked the sound of it. It began to mean something to their readers. By the end of that legislative session, Samuel Clemens, as Mark Twain, had acquired out there on that breezy western slope something resembling fame. Curiously, he fails to mention any of this success in his letters home of that period. Indeed, he seldom refers to his work, but more often speaks of mining shares which he has accumulated, and their possible values. His letters are airy, full of the joy of life and of the wild doings of the frontier. Closing one of them, he says, "I have just heard 5 pistol shots down the street. As such things are in my line, I will go and see about it." And in a postscript later he adds, 5 a.m. The pistol shots did their work well. One man, a Jackson County Missourian, shot 2 of my friends, police officers, through the heart. Both died within 3 minutes. The murderer's name is John Campbell. The Comstock was a great school for Mark Twain, and in Roughing It he has left us a faithful picture of its long-vanished glory. More than one national character came out of the Comstock school. Senator James G. Fair was one of them, and John Mackay, both miners with pick and shovel at first, though Mackay presently became a superintendent. Mark Twain one day laughingly offered to trade jobs with Mackay. "No," Mackay said, "I can't trade. My business is not worth as much as yours. I have never swindled anybody, and I don't intend to begin now." For both these men the future held splendid gifts. For Mackay, vast wealth. For Mark Twain, the world's applause. And neither would have long to wait. End of chapter 22. This is Chapter 23 of The Boy's Life of Mark Twain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Boy's Life of Mark Twain by Albert Bigelow Paine. Chapter 23, Artemis Ward and Literary San Francisco. It was about the end of 1863 that a new literary impulse came into Mark Twain's life. The gentle and lovable humorist Artemis Ward, Charles F. Brown, was that year lecturing in the West, and came to Virginia City. Ward had intended to stay only a few days. but the whirl of the Comstock fascinated him. He made the Enterprise office his headquarters, and remained 3 weeks. He and Mark Twain became boon companions. Their humor was not unlike. They were kindred spirits, together almost constantly. Ward was then at the summit of his fame, and gave the younger man the highest encouragement, prophesying great things for his work. Clemens, on his side, was stirred, perhaps for the first time, with a real literary ambition, and the thought that he, too, might win a place of honor. He promised Ward that he would send work to the Eastern papers. On Christmas Eve, Ward gave a dinner to the Enterprise staff at Chaumont's, a fine French restaurant of that day. When refreshments came, Artemus lifted his glass and said, "I give you Upper Canada." The company rose and drank the toast in serious silence. Then Mr. Goodman said, "Of course, Artemus, it's all right, but why did you give us Upper Canada?" "Because I don't want it myself," said Ward gravely. What would one not give to have listened to the talk of that evening? Mark Twain's power had awakened. Artemus Ward was in his prime. They were giants of a race that became extinct when Mark Twain died. Goodman remained rather quiet during the evening. Ward had appointed him to order the dinner, and he had attended to this duty without mingling much in the conversation. When Ward asked him why he did not join the banter, he said, "I am preparing a joke, Artemus, but I am keeping it for the present." At a late hour Ward finally called for the bill. It was $237. "What!" exclaimed Artemus. "That's my joke," said Goodman. "But I was only exclaiming because it was not twice as much," laughed Ward, laying the money on the table. Ward remained through the holidays, and later wrote back an affectionate letter to Mark Twain. "I shall always remember Virginia as a bright spot in my existence," he said, "as all others must, or rather cannot be, as it were." With Artemus Ward's encouragement, Mark Twain now began sending work eastward. The New York Sunday Mercury published one, possibly more, of his sketches, but they were not in his best vein, and made little impression. He may have been too busy for outside work, for the legislative session of 1864 was just beginning. Furthermore, he had been chosen governor of the Third House, a mock legislature organized for one session, to be held as a church benefit. The governor was to deliver a message, which meant that he was to burlesque from the platform all public officials and personages, from the real governor down. With the exception of a short talk he had once given at a printer's dinner in Keokuk, it was Mark Twain's first appearance as a speaker, and the beginning of a lifelong series of triumphs on the platform. The building was packed, the aisles full, the audience was ready for fun, and he gave it to them. Nobody escaped ridicule. From the beginning to end, the house was a storm of laughter and applause. Not a word of this first address of Mark Twain's has been preserved, but those who heard it always spoke of it as the greatest effort of his life, as to them it seemed, no doubt. For his Third House address, Clemens was presented with a gold watch inscribed, "To Governor Mark Twain." Everywhere now he was pointed out as a distinguished figure, and his quaint remarks were quoted. Few of these sayings are remembered today, though occasionally one is still unforgotten. At a party one night, being urged to make a conundrum, he said, "Well, why am I like the Pacific Ocean?" Several guesses were made, but he shook his head. Someone said, "We give it up. Tell us, Mark, why are you like the Pacific Ocean?" "I don't know," he drawled. "I was just asking for information." The governor of Nevada was generally absent, and Orion Clemens was executive head of the territory. His wife, who had joined him in Carson City, was social head of the little capital, and Brother Sam, with his new distinction and now once more something of a dandy in dress, was society's chief ornament, a great change, certainly, from the early months of his arrival less than 3 years before. It was near the end of May, 1864, when Mark Twain left Nevada for San Francisco. The immediate cause of his going was a duel elaborately arranged between Mark Twain and the editor of a rival paper, but never fought. In fact, it was mainly a burlesque affair throughout, chiefly concocted by that inveterate joker, Steve Gillis, already mentioned in connection with the pipe incident. The new dueling law, however, did not distinguish between real and mock affrays, and the prospect of being served with a summons made a good excuse for Clemens and Gillis to go to San Francisco, which had long attracted them. They were great friends, these two, and presently were living together and working on the same paper, the Morning Call, Clemens as a reporter and Gillis as a compositor. Gillis, with his tendency to mischief, was a constant exasperation to his roommate, who, goaded by some new torture, would sometimes denounce him in feverish terms. Yet they were never anything but the closest of friends. Mark Twain did not find happiness in his new position on the Call. There was less freedom and more drudgery than he had known on the Enterprise. His day was spent around the police court, attending fires, weddings, and funerals, with brief glimpses of the theaters at night. Once he wrote, "It was fearful drudgery, soulless drudgery, and almost destitute of interest. It was an awful slavery for a lazy man." It must have been so. There was little chance for original work. He had become just a part of a news machine. He saw many public abuses that he wished to expose, but the policy of the paper opposed him. Once, however, he found a policeman asleep on his beat. Going to a nearby vegetable stall, he borrowed a large cabbage leaf, came back, and stood over the sleeper, gently fanning him. He knew the paper would not publish the policeman's negligence, but he could advertise it in his own way. A large crowd soon collected, much amused. When he thought the audience large enough, he went away. Next day the joke was all over the city. He grew indifferent to the call work, and when an assistant was allowed him to do part of the running for items, it was clear to everybody that presently the assistant would be able to do it all. But there was a pleasant and profitable side to the San Francisco life. There were real literary people there, among them a young man with rooms upstairs in the Call office, Francis Bret Harte, editor of the Californian, a new literary weekly which Charles Henry Webb had recently founded. Bret Harte was not yet famous, but his gifts were recognized on the Pacific Slope, especially by the Era group of writers, the Golden Era being a literary monthly of considerable distinction. Joachim Miller recalls, from his diary of that period, having seen Prentice Mulford, Bret Harte, Charles Warren Stoddart, Mark Twain, Artemus Ward, and others, all assembled there at one time, a remarkable group certainly, to be dropped down behind the Sierras so long ago. They were a hopeful, happy lot, and sometimes received $5 for an article, which of course seemed a good deal more precious than a much larger sum earned in another way. Mark Twain had contributed to the Era while still in Virginia City, and now with Bret Harte was ranked as a leader of the group. The two were much together, and when Harte became editor of the Californian he engaged Clemens as a regular contributor at the very fancy rate of $12 an article. Some of the brief chapters included today in Sketches New and Old were done at that time. They have humor, but are not equal to his later work, and beyond the Pacific Slope they seem to have attracted little attention. In Roughing It, the author tells us how he finally was dismissed from the Call for general incompetency, and presently found himself in the depths of hard luck, debt, and poverty. But this is only his old habit of making a story on himself sound as uncomplimentary as possible. The true version is that the Call publisher and Mark Twain had a friendly talk and decided that it was better for both to break off the connection. Almost immediately he arranged to write a daily San Francisco letter for the Enterprise, for which he received $30 a week. This, with his earnings from the Californian, made his total return larger than before. Very likely he was hard up from time to time. Literary men are often that. But that he was ever in abject poverty, as he would have us believe, is just a good story, and not history. End of chapter 23. This is The Boy's Life of Mark Twain, chapter 24. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Boy's Life of Mark Twain by Albert Bigelow Paine. Chapter 24, The Discovery of the Jumping Frog. Mark Twain's daily letters to the Enterprise stirred up trouble for him in San Francisco. He was free now to write what he chose, and he attacked the corrupt police management with such fierceness that when copies of the Enterprise got back to San Francisco, they started a commotion at the City Hall. Then Mark Twain let himself go more vigorously than ever. He sent letters to the Enterprise that made even the printers afraid. Goodman, however, was fearless, and let them go in, word for word. The libel suit which the San Francisco chief of police brought against the Enterprise advertised the paper amazingly. But now came what at the time seemed an unfortunate circumstance. Steve Gillis, always a fearless defender of the weak, one night rushed to the assistance of two young fellows who had been set upon by three roughs. Gillis, though small of stature, was a terrific combatant, and he presently put two of the assailants to flight and had the other ready for the hospital. Next day it turned out that the roughs were henchmen of the police, and Gillis was arrested. Clemens went his bail and advised Steve to go down to Virginia City until the storm blew over. But it did not blow over for Mark Twain. The police department was only too glad to have a chance at the author of the fierce Enterprise letters, and promptly issued a summons for him, with an execution against his personal effects. If James N. Gillis, brother of Steve, had not happened along just then and spirited Mark Twain away to his mining camp in the Tuolumne Hills, the beautiful gold watch given to the governor of the Third House might have been sacrificed in the cause of friendship. As it was, he found himself presently in the far and peaceful seclusion of that land which Bret Harte would one day make famous with his tales of Roaring Camp and Sandy Bar. Jim Gillis was, in fact, the truthful James of Bret Harte, and his cabin on Jackass Hill had been the retreat of Harte and many another literary wayfarer who had wandered there for rest and refreshment and peace. It was said the sick were made well, and the well made better, in Jim Gillis's cabin. There were plenty of books and a variety of out-of-door recreation. One could mine there if he chose. Jim would furnish the visiting author with a promising claim, and teach him to follow the little fan-like drift of gold specks to the pocket of treasure somewhere up the hillside. Gillis himself had literary ability, though he never wrote. He told his stories, and with his back to the open fire would weave the most amazing tales, invented as he went along. His stories were generally wonderful adventures that had happened to his faithful companion Stoker, and Stoker never denied them, but would smoke and look into the fire, smiling a little sometimes, but never saying a word. A number of the tales later used by Mark Twain were first told by Jim Gillis in the cabin on Jackass Hill. Dick Baker's cat was one of these. The jaybird and acorn story in A Tramp Abroad was another. Mark Twain had little to add to these stories. "They are not mine, they are Jim's," he said once, "but I never could get them to sound like Jim. They were never as good as his." It was early in December 1864 when Mark Twain arrived at the humble retreat, built of logs under a great live oak tree and surrounded by a stretch of blue grass. A younger Gillis boy was there at the time, and also, of course, Dick Stoker and his cat Tom Quartz, which every reader of Roughing It knows. It was the rainy season, but on pleasant days they all went pocket mining, and in January Mark Twain, Gillis, and Stoker crossed over into Calaveras County and began work near Angel's Camp, a place well known to readers of Bret Harte. They put up at a poor hotel in Angel's, and on good days worked pretty faithfully, but it was generally raining, and the food was poor. In his notebook, still preserved, Mark Twain wrote, "January 27, 1865. Same old diet, same old weather. Went out to the pocket claim. Had to rush back." So they spent a good deal of their time around the rusty stove in the dilapidated tavern at Angel's Camp. It seemed a profitless thing to do, but few experiences were profitless to Mark Twain, and certainly this one was not. At this barren mining hotel there happened to be a former Illinois River pilot named Ben Coon, a solemn, sleepy person, who dozed by the stove or told slow, pointless stories to anyone who would listen. Not many would stay to hear him, but Jim Gillis and Mark Twain found him a delight. They would let him wander on in his dull way for hours, and saw a vast humor in a man to whom all tales, however trivial or absurd, were serious history. At last, one dreary afternoon, he told them about a frog that had belonged to a man named Coleman, who had trained it to jump, and how the trained frog had failed to win a wager because the owner of the rival frog had slyly loaded the trained jumper with shot. It was not a new story in the camps, but Ben Coon made a long tale of it, and it happened that neither Clemens nor Gillis had heard it before. They thought it amusing, and his solemn way of telling it still more so. "I don't see no p'ints about that frog that's better than any other frog," became a catch-phrase among the mining partners, and "I ain't got no frog, but if I had a frog, I'd bet you." Out on the claim, Clemens, watching Gillis and Stoker anxiously washing, would say, "I don't see no p'ints about that pan of dirt that's any better than any other pan of dirt." And so they kept the tale going. In his notebook, Mark Twain made a brief memorandum of the story for possible use. The mining was rather hopeless work. The constant and heavy rains were disheartening. Clemens hated it, and even when one afternoon traces of a pocket began to appear, he rebelled as the usual chill downpour set in. "Jim," he said, "let's go home. We'll freeze here." Gillis, as usual, was washing, and Clemens carrying the water. Gillis, seeing the gold color improving with every pan, wanted to go on washing and climbing toward the precious pocket, regardless of wet and cold. Clemens, shivering and disgusted, vowed that each pail of water would be his last. His teeth were chattering, and he was wet through. Finally he said, "Jim, I won't carry any more water. This work is too disagreeable." Gillis had just taken out a panful of dirt. "Bring one more pail, Sam," he begged. "Jim, I won't do it. I'm freezing." "Just one more pail, Sam," Jim pleaded. "No, sir, not a drop. Not if I knew there was $1,000,000 in that pan." Gillis tore out a page of his notebook and hastily posted a 30-day claim notice by the pan of dirt. Then they set out for Angel's Camp, never to return. It kept on raining, and a letter came from Steve Gillis saying he had settled all the trouble in San Francisco. Clemens decided to return, and the miners left Angel's without visiting their claim again. Meantime, the rain had washed away the top of the pan of dirt they had left standing on the hillside, exposing a handful of nuggets, pure gold. Two strangers, Austrians, happening along, gathered it up, and, seeing the claim notice posted by Jim Gillis, sat down to wait until it expired. They did not mind the rain, not under the circumstances, and the moment the 30 days were up they followed the lead a few pans farther and took out, some say $10,000, some say $20,000. In either case it was a good pocket that Mark Twain missed by one pail of water. Still, without knowing it, he had carried away in his notebook a single nugget of far greater value, the story of the jumping frog. He did not write it, however, immediately upon his return to San Francisco. He went back to his Enterprise letters and contributed some sketches to the Californian. Perhaps he thought the frog story too mild in humor for the Slope. By and by he wrote it, and by request sent it to Artemus Ward to be used in a book that Ward was about to issue. It arrived too late, and the publisher handed it to the editor of the Saturday Press, Henry Clapp, saying, "Here, Clapp, is something you can use in your paper." The press was struggling, and was glad to get a story so easily. Jim Smiley and His Jumping Frog appeared in the issue of November 18, 1865, and was at once copied and quoted far and near. It carried the name of Mark Twain across the mountains and the prairies of the Middle West. It bore it up and down the Atlantic slope. Someone said, then or later, that Mark Twain leapt into fame on the back of a jumping frog. Curiously, this did not at first please the author. He thought the tale poor. To his mother he wrote, "I do not know what to write. My life is so uneventful. I wish I was back there piloting up and down the river again. Verily, all is vanity and little worth, save piloting. To think that, after writing many an article, a man might be excused for thinking tolerably good, those New York people should single out a villainous backwoods sketch to compliment me on. Jim Smiley and his jumping frog, a squib which would never have been written but to please Artemis Ward. However, somewhat later he changed his mind considerably, especially when he heard that James Russell Lowell had pronounced the story the finest piece of humorous writing yet produced in America. End of chapter 24. This is chapter 25 of The Boy's Life of Mark Twain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Boy's Life of Mark Twain by Albert Bigelow Paine. Chapter 25, Hawaii and Anson, Burlingame. Mark Twain remained about a year in San Francisco after his return from the Gillis Cabin and Angel's Camp, adding to his prestige along the coast rather than to his national reputation. Then, in the spring of 1866, he was commissioned by the Sacramento Union to write a series of letters that would report the life, trade, agriculture, and general aspects of the Hawaiian group. He sailed in March, and his 4 months in those delectable islands remained always to him a golden memory, an experience which he hoped some day to repeat. He was young and eager for adventure then, and he went everywhere, horseback and afoot, saw everything, did everything, and wrote of it all for his paper. His letters to the Union were widely read and quoted, and, though not especially literary, added much to his journalistic standing. He was a great sightseer in those days, and a persevering one. No discomfort or risk discouraged him. Once, with a single daring companion, he crossed the burning floor of the mighty crater of Kilauea, racing across the burning lava, leaping wide and bottomless crevices where a misstep would have meant death. His open-air life on the river and in the mining camps had nerved and hardened him for adventure. He was 30 years old, and in his physical prime. His mental growth had been slower, but it was sure, and it would seem always to have had the right guidance at the right time. Clemens had been in the islands 3 months when one day Anson Burlingame arrived there en route to his post as minister to China. With him was his son Edward, a boy of 18, and General Van Valkenburg, minister to Japan. Young Burlingame had read about Jim Smiley's jumping frog, and learning that the author was in Honolulu, but ill after a long trip inland, sent word that the party would call on him next morning. But Mark Twain felt that he could not accept this honor, and, crawling out of bed, shaved himself and drove to the home of the American minister, where the party was staying. He made a great impression with the diplomats. It was an occasion of good stories and much laughter. On leaving, General Van Valkenburg said to him, "California is proud of Mark Twain, and some day the American people will be too, no doubt," which was certainly a good prophecy. It was only a few days later that the diplomats rendered him a great service. Report had come of the arrival at Sanpahoe of an open boat containing 15 starving men who had been buffeting a stormy sea for 43 days, sailors from the missing ship Hornet of New York, which it appeared had been burned at sea. Presently 11 of the rescued men were brought to Honolulu and placed in the hospital. Mark Twain recognized the great importance as news of this event. It would be a splendid beat if he could interview the castaways and be the first to get their story in his paper. There was no cable, but a vessel was sailing for San Francisco next morning. It seemed the opportunity of a lifetime, but he was now bedridden and could scarcely move. Then suddenly appeared in his room Anson Burlingame and his party, and, almost before Mark Twain realized what was happening, he was on a cot, and, escorted by the heads of 2 legations, was on his way to the hospital to get the precious interview. Once there, Anson Burlingame, with his gentle manner and courtly presence, drew from those enfeebled castaways all the story of the burning of the vessel, followed by the long privation and struggle that had lasted through 43 fearful days and across 4,000 miles of stormy sea. All that Mark Twain had to do was to listen and make notes. That night he wrote against time, and next morning, just as the vessel was drifting from the dock, a strong hand flung his bulky manuscript aboard, and his great beat was sure. The 3-column story, published in the Sacramento Union of July 9, gave the public the first detailed history of the great disaster. The telegraph carried it everywhere, and it was featured as a sensation. Mark Twain and the Burlingame party were much together during the rest of their stay in Hawaii, and Samuel Clemens never ceased to love and honor the memory of Anson Burlingame. It was proper that he should do so, for he owed him much, far more than has already been told. Anson Burlingame one day said to him, "You have great ability. I believe you have genius. What you need now is the refinement of association. Seek companionship among men of superior intellect and character. Refine yourself and your work. Never affiliate with inferiors. Always climb." This, coming to him from a man of Burlingame's character and position, was like a gospel from some divine source. Clemens never forgot the advice. It gave him courage, new hope, new resolve, new ideals. Burlingame came often to the hotel, and they discussed plans for Mark Twain's future. The diplomat invited the journalist to visit him in China. "Come to Peking," he said, "and make my house your home." Young Burlingame also came, when the patient became convalescent, and suggested walks. Once, when Clemens hesitated, the young man said, "But there is a scriptural command for you to go." "If you can quote one, I'll obey," said Clemens. "Very well. The Bible says, 'If any man require thee to walk a mile, go with him twain.'" The walk was taken. Mark Twain returned to California at the end of July and went down to Sacramento. It was agreed that a special bill should be made for the Hornet report. "How much do you think it ought to be, Mark?" asked one of the proprietors. Clemens said, "Oh, I'm an honest man. I don't want the whole Union office. Call it $100 a column." There was a general laugh. The bill was made out at that figure, and he took it to the office for payment. "The cashier didn't faint," he wrote many years later, "but he came rather near it. He sent for the proprietors, and they only laughed in their jolly fashion and said it was robbery, but no matter, pay it. It's all right. The best men that ever owned a paper." Footnote number 6. My debut as a literary person. End of footnote. End of chapter 25. This is Chapter 26 of The Boy's Life of Mark Twain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Boy's Life of Mark Twain by Albert Bigelow Paine. Chapter 26. Mark Twain, Lecturer. In spite of the success of his Sandwich Island letters, Samuel Clemens felt, on his return to San Francisco, that his future was not bright. He was not a good all-round newspaper man. He was special correspondent and sketch-writer, out of a job. He had a number of plans, but they did not promise much. One idea was to make a book from his Hawaiian material. Another was to write magazine articles, beginning with one on the Hornet disaster. He did, in fact, write the Hornet article, and its prompt acceptance by Harper's Magazine delighted him, for it seemed a start in the right direction. A third plan was to lecture on the islands. This prospect frightened him. He had succeeded in his third house address of 2 years before, but then he had lectured without charge and for a church benefit. This would be a different matter. One of the proprietors of a San Francisco paper, Colonel John McComb, of the Alta California, was strong in his approval of the lecture idea. "Do it, by all means," he said. "Take the largest house in the city and charge $1 a ticket." Without waiting until his fright came back, Mark Twain hurried to the manager of the Academy of Music and engaged it for a lecture to be given October 2nd, 1866, and sat down and wrote his announcement. He began by stating what he would speak upon, and ended with a few absurdities, such as, "A splendid orchestra is in town, but has not been engaged. Also, A den of ferocious wild beasts will be on exhibition in the next block. A grand torchlight procession may be expected. In fact, the public are privileged to expect whatever they please. Doors open at 7 o'clock. The trouble will begin at 8 o'clock. Mark Twain was well known in San Francisco, and was pretty sure to have a good house. But he did not realize this, and as the evening approached, his dread of failure increased. Arriving at the theater, he entered by the stage door, half expecting to find the place empty. Then, suddenly, he became more frightened than ever. Peering from the wings, he saw that the house was jammed, packed from the footlights to the walls. Terrified, his knees shaking, his tongue dry, he managed to emerge, and was greeted with a roar, a crash of applause that nearly finished him. Only for an instant reaction followed. These people were his friends, and he was talking to them. He forgot to be afraid, and as the applause came in great billows that rose ever higher, he felt himself borne with it as on a tide of happiness and success. His evening, from beginning to end, was a complete triumph. Friends declared that for descriptive eloquence, humor, and real entertainment nothing like his address had ever been delivered. The morning papers were enthusiastic. Mark Twain no longer hesitated as to what he should do now. He would lecture. The book idea no longer attracted him. The appearance of the Hornet article, signed, through a printer's error, Mark Twain, cooled his desire to be a magazine contributor. No matter, lecturing was the thing. Dennis McCarthy, who had sold his interest in the Enterprise, was in San Francisco. Clemens engaged this honest, happy-hearted Irishman as manager, and the two toured California and Nevada with continuous success. Those who remember Mark Twain as a lecturer in that early day say that on entering he would lounge loosely across the platform, his manuscript, written on wrapping paper and carried under his arm, looking like a ruffled hen. His delivery they recall as being even more quaint and drawling than in later life. Once, when his lecture was over, an old man came up to him and said, "Be them your natural tones of eloquence?" In those days it was thought proper that a lecturer should be introduced, and Clemens himself used to tell of being presented by an old miner who said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I know only two things about this man. The first is that he's never been in jail, and the second is, I don't know why." When he reached Virginia, his old friend Goodman said, "Sam, you don't need anybody to introduce you," and he suggested a novel plan. That night, when the curtain rose, it showed Mark Twain seated at a piano, playing and singing, as if still cub pilot on the John J. Roe. "Had an old horse whose name was Methusalem, took him down and sold him in Jerusalem a long time ago." Pretending to be surprised and startled at the burst of applause, he sprang up and began to talk. How the audience enjoyed it! Mark Twain continued his lecture tour into December, and then, on the 15th of that month, sailed by way of the Isthmus of Panama for New York. He had made some money and was going home to see his people. He had planned to make a trip around the world later, contributing a series of letters to the Alta California, lecturing where opportunity afforded. He had been on the coast 5.5 years, and to his professions of printing and piloting had added 3 others, mining, journalism, and lecturing. Also, he had acquired a measure of fame. He could come back to his people with a good account of his absence and a good heart for the future. But it seems now only a chance that he arrived at all. Crossing the isthmus, he embarked for New York on what proved to be a cholera ship. For a time there were 1 or more funerals daily. An entry in his diary says, "Since the last 2 hours all laughter, all levity has ceased on the ship. A settled gloom is upon the faces of the passengers." But the winter air of the North checked the contagion, and there were no new cases when New York City was reached. Clemens remained but a short time in New York, and was presently in St. Louis with his mother and sister. They thought he looked old, but he had not changed in manner, and the gay banter between mother and son was soon as lively as ever. He was 31 now, and she 64, but the years had made little difference. She petted him, joked with him, and scolded him. In turn he petted and comforted and teased her. She decided he was the same Sam and always would be, a true prophecy. He visited Hannibal and lectured there, receiving an ovation that would have satisfied even Tom Sawyer. In Keokuk he lectured again, then returned to St. Louis to plan his trip around the world. He was not to make a trip around the world, however, not then. In St. Louis he saw the notice of the great Quaker City Holy Land excursion, the first excursion of the kind ever planned, and was greatly taken with the idea. Impulsive as always, he wrote at once to the Alta California, proposing that they send him as their correspondent on this grand ocean picnic. The cost of passage was $1,200, and the Alta hesitated, but Colonel McComb, already mentioned, assured his associates that the investment would be sound. The Alta wrote, accepting Mark Twain's proposal, and agreed to pay $20 each for letters. Clemens hurried to New York to secure a berth, fearing the passenger list might be full. Furthermore, with no one of distinction to vouch for him, according to advertised requirements, he was not sure of being accepted. Arriving in New York, he learned from an Alta representative that passage had already been reserved for him, but he still doubted his acceptance as one of the distinguished advertised company. His mind was presently relieved on this point. Waiting his turn at the booking desk, he heard a newspaper man inquire, "What notables are going?" A clerk, with evident pride, rattled off the names, "Lieutenant General Sherman, Henry Ward Beecher, and Mark Twain. Also, probably, General Banks." It was very pleasant to hear the clerk say that. Not only was he accepted, but billed as an attraction. The Quaker City would not sail for 2 months yet, and during the period of waiting Mark Twain was far from idle. He wrote New York letters to the Alta, and he embarked in 2 rather important ventures. He published his first book, and he delivered a lecture in New York City. Both these undertakings were planned and carried out by friends from the coast. Charles Henry Webb, who had given up his magazine to come East, had collected "The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County" and other sketches, and, after trying in vain to find a publisher for them, brought them out himself on the 1st of May, 1867. Footnote number 7. The printing was done by John A. Gray and Green, the firm for which the boy Sam Clemens had set type 13 years before. End of footnote number 7. It seems curious now that any publisher should have declined the little volume, for the sketches, especially the frog story, had been successful, and there was little enough good American humor in print. However, publishing was a matter not lightly undertaken in those days. Mark Twain seems to have been rather pleased with the appearance of his first book. To Bret Harte he wrote, "The book is out and is handsome. It is full of errors, but be a friend and say nothing about those things. When my hurry is over, I will send you a copy to pison the children with." The little cloth and gold volume, so valued by book collectors today, contained the frog story and 26 other sketches, some of which are still preserved in Mark Twain's collected works. Most of them were not Mark Twain's best literature, but they were fresh and readable and suited the taste of that period. The book sold very well, and while it did not bring either great fame or fortune to its author, it was by no means a failure. The hurry mentioned in Mark Twain's letter to Bret Harte related to his second venture, that is to say, his New York lecture, an enterprise managed by an old Comstock friend, Frank Fuller, ex-governor of Utah. Fuller, always a sanguine and energetic person, had proposed the lecture idea as soon as Mark Twain arrived in New York. Clemens shook his head. "I have no reputation with the general public here," he said. "We couldn't get a baker's dozen to hear me." But Fuller insisted, and eventually engaged the largest hall in New York, the Cooper Union. Full of enthusiasm and excitement, he plunged into the business of announcing and advertising his attraction, and inventing schemes for the sale of seats. Clemens caught Fuller's enthusiasm by spells, but between times he was deeply depressed. Fuller had got up a lot of tiny handbills, and had arranged to hang bunches of these in the horse-cars. The little dangling clusters fascinated Clemens, and he rode about to see if anybody else noticed them. Finally, after a long time, a passenger pulled off one of the bills and glanced at it. A man with him asked, "Who's Mark Twain?" "Goodness knows, I don't." The lecturer could not ride any farther. He hunted up his patron. "Fuller," he groaned, "there isn't a sign, a ripple of interest." Fuller assured him that things were working underneath, and would be all right. But Clemens wrote home, "Everything looks shady, at least, if not dark," and he added that after hiring the largest house in New York he must play against Schuyler Colfax, Ristori, and a double troupe of Japanese jugglers at other places of amusement. When the evening of the lecture approached and only a few tickets had been sold, the lecturer was desperate. "Fuller," he said, "there'll be nobody in Cooper Union that night but you and me. I am on the verge of suicide. I would commit suicide if I had the pluck and the outfit. You must paper the house, Fuller. You must send out a flood of complimentaries." "Very well," said Fuller. "What we want this time is reputation, anyway. Money is secondary. I'll put you before the choicest and most intelligent audience that was ever gathered in New York City." Fuller immediately sent out complimentary tickets to the school teachers of New York and Brooklyn, a general invitation to come and hear Mark Twain's great lecture on the Sandwich Islands. There was nothing to do after that but wait results. Mark Twain had lost faith. He did not believe anybody in New York would come to hear him, even on a free ticket. When the night arrived, he drove with Fuller to the Cooper Union half an hour before the lecture was to begin. 40 years later he said, "I couldn't keep away. I wanted to see that vast mammoth cave and die. But when we got near the building I saw all the streets were blocked with people and that traffic had stopped. I couldn't believe that these people were trying to get to the Cooper Institute, but they were. And when I got to the stage at last, the house was jammed full, packed. There wasn't room enough left for a child. I was happy, and I was excited beyond expression. I poured the Sandwich Islands out on those people, and they laughed and shouted to my entire content. For an hour and 15 minutes I was in paradise." So in its way this venture was a success. It brought Mark Twain a good deal of a reputation in New York, even if no financial profit, though in spite of the flood of complimentaries there was a cash return of something like $300. This went a good way toward paying the expenses, while Fuller, in his royal way, insisted on making up the deficit, declaring he had been paid for everything in the fun and joy of the game. "Mark," he said, "it's all right. The fortune didn't come, but it will. The fame has arrived. With this lecture and your book just out, you are going to be the most talked-of man in the country. Your letters to the Alta and the Tribune will get the widest reception of any letters of travel ever written." End of chapter 26. This is chapter 27 of The Boy's Life of Mark Twain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Boy's Life of Mark Twain by Albert Bigelow Paine. Chapter 27. An Innocent Abroad and Home Again. It was early in May, the 6th, that Mark Twain had delivered his Cooper Union lecture, and a month later, June 8, 1867, he sailed on the Quaker City with some 66 other pilgrims on the great Holy Land excursion, the story of which has been so fully and faithfully told in The Innocents Abroad. What a wonderful thing it must have seemed in that time for a party of excursionists to have a ship all to themselves to go a-gypsying in from port to port of antiquity and romance. The advertised celebrities did not go, none of them but Mark Twain. But no one minded presently, for Mark Twain's sayings and stories kept the company sufficiently entertained, and sometimes he would read aloud to his fellow passengers from the newspaper letters he was writing, and invite comment and criticism. That was entertainment for them, and it was good for him, for it gave him an immediate audience, always inspiring to an author. Furthermore, the comments offered were often of the greatest value, especially suggestions from one Mrs. Fairbanks, of Cleveland, a middle-aged cultured woman, herself a correspondent for her husband's paper, the Herald. It requires not many days for acquaintances to form on shipboard, and in due time a little group gathered regularly each afternoon to hear Mark Twain read what he had written of their day's doings, though some of it he destroyed later because Mrs. Fairbanks thought it not his best. All of the pilgrims mentioned in The Innocents Abroad were real persons. Dan was Dan Slote, Mark Twain's roommate. The doctor who confused the guides was Dr. A. Reeves Jackson of Chicago. The poet laureate was Bloodgood H. Cutter, an eccentric from Long Island. Jack was Jack Van Nostrand of New Jersey, and Moult and Blucher and Charlie were likewise real, the last named being Charles J. Langdon of Elmira, New York, a boy of 18, whose sister would one day become Mark Twain's wife. It has been said that Mark Twain first met Olivia Langdon on the Quaker City, but this is not quite true. He met only her picture. The original was not on that ship. Charlie Langdon, boy fashion, made a sort of hero of the brilliant man called Mark Twain, and one day in the Bay of Smyrna invited him to his cabin and exhibited his treasures, among them a dainty miniature of a sister at home, Olivia, a sweet, delicate creature whom the boy worshipped. Samuel Clemens gazed long at the exquisite portrait and spoke of it reverently, for in the sweet face he seemed to find something spiritual. Often after that he came to young Langdon's cabin to look at the pictured countenance, in his heart dreaming of a day when he might learn to know its owner. We need not follow in detail here the travels of the pilgrims and their adventures. Most of them have been fully set down in The Innocents Abroad, and with not much elaboration, for plenty of amusing things were happening on a trip of that kind, and Mark Twain's old notebooks are full of the real incidents that we find changed but little in the book. If the adventures of Jack, Dan, and the doctor are embroidered here and there, the truth is always there, too. Yet the old notebooks have a very intimate interest of their own. It is curious to be looking through them today, trying to realize that those penciled memoranda were the fresh first impressions that would presently grow into the world's most delightful book of travel, that they were set down in the very midst of that historic little company that frolicked through Italy and climbed wearily the arid Syrian hills. It required 5 months for the Quaker City to make the circuit of the Mediterranean and return to New York. Mark Twain in that time contributed 52 or 3 letters to the Alta California and 6 to the New York Tribune, or an average of nearly 3 a week, a vast amount of labor to be done in the midst of sightseeing. And what letters of travel they were! The most remarkable that had been written up to that time. Vivid, fearless, full of fresh color, humor, poetry, they came as a revelation to the public weary of the tiresome descriptive drivel of that day. They preached a new gospel in travel literature, the gospel of seeing honestly and speaking frankly, a gospel that Mark Twain would continue to preach during the rest of his career. Furthermore, the letters showed a great literary growth in their author. No doubt the cultivated associations of the ship, the afternoon reading aloud of his work, and Mrs. Fairbanks' advice had much to do with this. But we may believe, also, that the author's close study of the King James Version of the Old Testament during the weeks of travel through Palestine exerted a powerful influence upon his style. The man who had recited the burial of Moses to Joe Goodman with so much feeling could not fail to be mastered by the simple yet stately Bible phrase and imagery. Many of the fine descriptive passages in The Innocents Abroad have something almost biblical in their phrasing. The writer of this memoir heard in childhood The Innocents Abroad read aloud, and has never forgotten the poetic spell that fell upon him as he listened to a paragraph written of Tangier. Here is a crumbled wall that was old when Columbus discovered America, old when Peter the Hermit roused the knightly men of the Middle Ages to arm for the first crusade, old when Charlemagne and his paladins beleaguered enchanted castles and battled with giants and genii in the fabled days of the olden time, old when Christ and his disciples walked the earth, stood where it stands today, when the lips of Memnon were vocal and men bought and sold in the streets of ancient Thebes. Mark Twain returned to America to find himself, if not famous, at least in very high repute. The Alta and Tribune letters had carried his name to every corner of his native land. He was in demand now. To his mother he wrote, "I have 18 offers to lecture, at $100 each, in various parts of the Union. Have declined them all. Belong on the Tribune staff, and shall write occasionally. Am offered the same berth today on the Herald by letter." He was in Washington at this time, having remained in New York but one day. He had accepted a secretaryship from Senator Stewart of Nevada, but this arrangement was a brief one. He required fuller freedom for his Washington correspondence and general literary undertakings. He had been in Washington but a few days when he received a letter that meant more to him than he could possibly have dreamed at the moment. It was from Elisha Bliss, Jr., manager of the American Publishing Company of Hartford, Connecticut, and it suggested gathering the Mediterranean travel letters into a book. Bliss was a capable, energetic man with a taste for humor, and believed there was money for author and publisher in the travel book. The proposition pleased Mark Twain, who replied at once, asking for further details as to Bliss's plan. Somewhat later he made a trip to Hartford, and the terms for the publication of The Innocents Abroad were agreed upon. It was to be a large, illustrated book for subscription sale, and the author was to receive 5% of the selling price. Bliss had offered him the choice between this royalty and $10,000 cash. Though much tempted by the large sum to be paid in hand, Mark Twain decided in favor of the royalty plan. "The best business judgment I ever displayed," he used to say afterward. He agreed to arrange the letters for book publication, revising and rewriting where necessary, and went back to Washington well pleased. He did not realize that his agreement with Bliss marked the beginning of one of the most notable publishing connections in American literary history. End of chapter 27. This is chapter 28 of The Boy's Life of Mark Twain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Boy's Life of Mark Twain by Albert Bigelow Paine, Chapter 28. Olivia Langdon, Work on the Innocents. Certainly this was a momentous period in Mark Twain's life. It was a time of great events, and among them was one which presently would come to mean more to him than all the rest, the beginning of his acquaintance with Olivia Langdon. One evening in late December, when Samuel Clemens had come to New York to visit his old Quaker City roommate, Dan Slote, he found there other ship comrades, including Jack Van Nostrand and Charlie Langdon. It was a joyful occasion, but one still happier followed it. Young Langdon's father and sister Olivia were in New York, and an evening or two later the boy invited his distinguished Quaker City shipmate to dine with them at the old St. Nicholas Hotel. We may believe that Samuel Clemens went willingly enough. He had never forgotten the September day in the Bay of Smyrna when he had first seen the sweet-faced miniature. Now at last he looked upon the reality. Long afterward he said, "It was 40 years ago. From that day to this she has never been out of my mind." Charles Dickens gave a reading that night at Steinway Hall. The Langdons attended, and Samuel Clemens with them. He recalled long after that Dickens wore a black velvet coat with a fiery red flower in his buttonhole, and that he read the storm scene from David Copperfield, the death of James Steerforth, but he remembered still more clearly the face and dress and the slender, girlish figure of Olivia Langdon at his side. Olivia Langdon was 22 years old at this time, delicate as the miniature he had seen, though no longer in the fragile health of her girlhood. Gentle, winning, lovable, she was the family idol, and Samuel Clemens was no less her worshipper from the first moment of their meeting. Miss Langdon, on her part, was at first rather dazed by the strange, brilliant, handsome man, so unlike anything she had known before. When he had gone, she had the feeling that something like a great meteor had crossed her sky. To her brother, who was eager for her good opinion of his celebrity, she admitted her admiration, if not her entire approval. Her father had no doubts. With a keen sense of humor and a deep knowledge of men, Jervis Langdon was from that first evening the devoted champion of Mark Twain. Clemens saw Miss Langdon again during the holidays, and by the week's end he had planned to visit Elmira soon. But fate managed differently. He was not to see Elmira for the better part of a year. He returned to his work in Washington, the preparation of the book and his newspaper correspondence. It was in connection with the latter that he first met General Grant, then not yet President. The incident, characteristic of both men, is worth remembering. Mark Twain had called by permission, elated with the prospect of an interview. But when he looked into the square, smileless face of the soldier, he found himself, for the first time in his life, without anything particular to say. Grant nodded slightly and waited. His caller wished something would happen. It did. His inspiration returned. "General," he said, "I seem to be slightly embarrassed. Are you?" Grant's severity broke up in laughter. There were no further difficulties. Work on the book did not go so well. There were many distractions in Washington, and Clemens did not like the climate there. Then he found the Alta had copyrighted his letters and were reluctant to allow him to use them. He decided to sail at once for San Francisco. If he could arrange the Alta matter, he would finish his work there. He did, in fact, carry out this plan, and all difficulties vanished on his arrival. His old friend Colonel Macomb obtained for him free use of the Alta letters. The way was now clear for his book. His immediate need of funds, however, induced him to lecture. In May he wrote Bliss, "I lectured here on the trip (the Quaker City excursion) the other night. $1,600 in gold in the house, every seat taken and paid for before night." He settled down to work now with his usual energy, editing and rewriting, and in 2 months had the big manuscript ready for delivery. Mark Twain's friends urged him to delay his return to the States long enough to make a lecture tour through California and Nevada. He must give his new lecture, they told him, to his old friends. He agreed, and was received at Virginia City, Carson, and elsewhere like a returning conqueror. He lectured again in San Francisco just before sailing. The announcement of his lecture was highly original. It was a handbill supposed to have been issued by the foremost citizens of San Francisco, a mock protest against his lecture, urging him to return to New York without inflicting himself on them again. On the same bill was printed his reply. In it he said, "I will torment the people if I want to. It only costs them $1 apiece, and if they can't stand it, what do they stay for?" He promised positively to sail on July 6th if they would let him talk just this once. There was a good deal more of this drollery on the bill, which ended with the announcement that he would appear at the Mercantile Library on July 2nd. It is unnecessary to say that the place was jammed on that evening. It was probably the greatest lecture event San Francisco has ever known. 4 days later, July 6, 1868, Mark Twain sailed, via Aspinwall, for New York, and on the 28th delivered the manuscript of The Innocents Abroad, or The New Pilgrim's Progress, to his Hartford publisher. End of chapter 28. This is chapter 29 of The Boy's Life of Mark Twain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Boy's Life of Mark Twain, by Albert Bigelow Paine, Chapter 29, The Visit to Elmira and Its Consequences. Samuel Clemens now decided to pay his long-deferred visit to the Langdon home in Elmira. Through Charlie Langdon he got the invitation renewed, and for a glorious week enjoyed the generous hospitality of the beautiful Langdon home and the society of fair Olivia Langdon, Livy as they called her, realizing more and more that for him there could never be any other woman in the world. He spoke no word of this to her, but on the morning of the day when his visit would end he relieved himself to Charlie Langdon, much to the young man's alarm. Greatly as he admired Mark Twain himself, he did not think him, or indeed any man, good enough for Livy, whom he considered little short of a saint. Clemens was to take a train that evening, but young Langdon said when he recovered, "Look here, Clemens, "There's a train in half an hour. I'll help you catch it. Don't wait until tonight. Go now." Mark Twain shook his head. "No, Charlie," he said in his gentle drawl, "I want to enjoy your hospitality a little longer. I promise to be circumspect, and I'll go tonight." That night after dinner, when it was time to take the train, a light two-seated wagon was at the gate. Young Langdon and his guest took the back seat, which for some reason had not been locked in its place. The horse started with a quick forward spring, and the seat with its two occupants described a circle and landed with force on the cobbled street. Neither passenger was seriously hurt, only dazed a little for the moment. But to Mark Twain there came a sudden inspiration. Here was a chance to prolong his visit. When the Langdon household gathered with restoratives, he did not recover at once, and allowed himself to be supported to an armchair for further remedies. Livy Langdon showed especial anxiety. He was not allowed to go now, of course. He must stay until it was certain that his recovery was complete. Perhaps he had been internally injured. His visit was prolonged 2 weeks, 2 weeks of pure happiness. And when he went away, he had fully resolved to win Livy Langdon for his wife. Mark Twain now went to Hartford to look after his book proofs, and there for the first time met the Reverend Joseph H. Twichell, who would become his closest friend. The two men, so different in many ways, always had the fondest admiration for each other. Each recognized in the other great courage, humanity, and sympathy. Clemens would gladly have remained in Hartford that winter. Twichell presented him to many congenial people, including Charles Dudley Warner, Harriet Beecher Stowe, and other writing folk, but flattering lecture offers were made him, and he could no longer refuse. He called his new lecture "The Vandal Abroad," it being chapters from the forthcoming book, and it was a great success everywhere. His houses were crowded, the newspapers were enthusiastic. His delivery was described as a long, monotonous drawl, with fun invariably coming in at the end of a sentence, after a pause. He began to be recognized everywhere, to have great popularity. People came out on the street to see him pass. Many of his lecture engagements were in central New York, no great distance from Elmira. He had a standing invitation to visit the Langdon home, and went when he could. His courtship, however, was not entirely smooth. Much as Mr. Langdon honored his gifts and admired him personally, he feared that his daughter, who had known so little of life and the outside world, and the brilliant traveler, lecturer, author, might not find happiness in marriage. Many absurd stories have been told of Mark Twain's first interview with Jervis Langdon on this subject, but these are without foundation. It was an earnest discussion on both sides, and left Samuel Clemens rather crestfallen, though not without hope. More than once the subject was discussed between the two men that winter as the lecturer came and went, his fame always growing. In time the Langdon household had grown to feel that he belonged to them. It would be only a step further to make him really one of the family. There was no positive engagement at first, for it was agreed between Clemens and Jervis Langdon that letters should be sent by Mr. Langdon to those who had known his would-be son-in-law earlier, with inquiries as to his past conduct and general character. It was a good while till answers to these came, and when they arrived Samuel Clemens was on hand to learn the result. Mr. Langdon had a rather solemn look when they were alone together. Clemens asked, "You've heard from those gentlemen out there?" "Yes, and from another gentleman I wrote to concerning you." "They don't appear to have been very enthusiastic from your manner." "Well, yes, some of them were." "I suppose I may ask what particular form their emotion took?" "Oh, yes, yes. They agree unanimously that you are a brilliant, able man, a man with a future, and that you would make about the worst husband on record." The applicant had a forlorn look. "There is nothing very evasive about that," he said. Langdon reflected. "Haven't you any other friend that you could suggest?" "Apparently none whose testimony would be valuable." Jervis Langdon held out his hand. "You have at least one," he said. I believe in you. I know you better than they do." The engagement of Samuel Langhorne Clemens and Olivia Lewis Langdon was ratified next day, February 4th, 1869. To Jane Clemens her son wrote, "She is a little body, but she hasn't her peer in Christendom." End of chapter 29. This is chapter 30 of The Boy's Life of Mark Twain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Boy's Life of Mark Twain by Albert Bigelow Paine. Chapter 30, The New Book and a Wedding. Clemens closed his lecture tour in March with a profit of something more than $8,000. He had intended to make a spring tour of California, but went to Elmira instead. The revised proofs of his book were coming now, and he and gentle Livy Langdon read them together. Samuel Clemens realized presently that the girl he had chosen had a delicate literary judgment. She became all at once his editor, a position she held until her death. Her refining influence had much to do with Mark Twain's success, then and later, and the world owes her a debt of gratitude. Through that first pleasant summer these two worked at the proofs and planned for their future, and were very happy indeed. It was about the end of July when the big book appeared at last, and its success was startling. Nothing like it had ever been known before. Mark Twain's name seemed suddenly to be on every tongue, his book in everybody's hands. From one end of the country to the other, readers were hailing him as the greatest humorist and descriptive writer of modern times. By the first of the year, more than 30,000 volumes had been sold. It was a book of travel. Its lowest price was $3.50. The record has not been equaled since. In England also large editions had been issued, and translations into foreign languages were under way. It was and is a great book because it is a human book, a book written straight from the heart. If Mark Twain had not been famous before, he was so now. Indeed, it is doubtful if any other American author was so widely known and read as the author of The Innocents Abroad during that first half-year after its publication. Yet, for some reason, he still did not regard himself as a literary man. He was a journalist, and began to look about for a paper which he could buy, his idea being to establish a business and a home. Through Mr. Langdon's assistance he finally obtained an interest in the Buffalo Express, and the end of the year 1869 found him established as its associate editor, though still lecturing here and there, because his wedding day was near at hand and there must be no lack of funds. It was the 2nd of February, 1870, that Samuel Clemens and Olivia Langdon were married. A few days before, he sat down one night and wrote to Jim Gillis, away out in the Tuolumne Hills, and told him of all his good fortune, recalling their days at Angel's Camp and the absurd frog story, which he said had been the beginning of his happiness. In the 5 years since then he had traveled a long way, but he had not forgotten. On the morning of his wedding day Mark Twain received from his publisher a check for $4,000, his profit from 3 months' sales of the book, a handsome sum. The wedding was mainly a family affair. Twichell and his wife came over from Hartford, Twichell to assist Thomas K. Beecher in performing the ceremony. Jane Clemens could not come, nor Orion and his wife. But Pamela, a widow now, and her daughter Annie, grown to a young lady, arrived from St. Louis. Not more than 100 guests gathered in the stately Langdon parlors that in future would hold so much history for Samuel Clemens and Olivia Langdon, so much of the story of life and death that thus made its beginning there. Then at 7 in the evening they were married, and the bride danced with her father, and the Reverend Thomas Beecher declared she wore the longest gloves he had ever seen. It was the next afternoon that the wedding party set out for Buffalo. Through a Mr. Slee, an agent of Mr. Langdon's, Clemens had engaged, as he supposed, a boarding-house, quiet and unpretentious, for he meant to start his married life modestly. Jervis Langdon had a plan of his own for his daughter, but Clemens had received no inkling of it, and had full faith in the letter which Slee had written, saying that a choice and inexpensive boarding-house had been secured. When, about 9 o'clock that night, the party reached Buffalo, they found Mr. Slee waiting at the station. There was snow, and sleighs had been ordered. Soon after starting, the sleigh of the bride and groom fell behind and drove about rather aimlessly, apparently going nowhere in particular. This disturbed the groom, who thought they should arrive first and receive their guests. He criticized Slee for selecting a house that was so hard to find, and when they turned at last into Delaware Avenue, Buffalo's finest street, and stopped before a handsome house, he was troubled concerning the richness of the locality. They were on the steps when the door opened and a perfect fairyland of lights and decoration was revealed within. The friends who had gone ahead came out with greetings to lead in the bride and groom. Servants hurried forward to take bags and wraps. They were ushered inside. They were led through beautiful rooms, all newly appointed and garnished. The bridegroom was dazed, unable to understand the meaning of it all, the completeness of their possession. At last his young wife put her hand upon his arm. "Don't you understand, youth?" she said. That was always her name for him. "Don't you understand? It is ours, all ours, everything, a gift from father." But still he could not quite grasp it, and Mr. Langdon brought a little box, and, opening it, handed them the deeds. Nobody quite remembers what was the first remark that Samuel Clemens made, but either then or a little later he said, "Mr. Langdon, whenever you are in Buffalo, if it's twice a year, come right here. Bring your bag and stay overnight if you want to. Shan't cost you a cent." End of chapter 30.